I'm Nina Carter, and I'm the president of the Olympia World Affairs Council, and I welcome everyone tonight to our presentation about the borders, so not the southern border, but the northern border with Canada. And Dr. Trautman will speak to us for about 45 minutes about her work and her research. And let me just tell you a couple of Zoom protocols. Please keep your microphone muted. And if you want to ask a question of our speaker, just go ahead and put it in the chat. And Amy, my fellow board member, and I will be going through those questions at the end so that we can give those to Dr. Trautman in a sort of an orderly fashion. And as I said earlier, if anyone wants to raise their hand at the last minute, that's fine too, and we'll take some questions at the end. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Trautman. Laurie Trautman is the director of the Border Policy Research Institute, and she has a very illustrious background in geography. She has her PhD in geography from the University of Oregon, master's from Montana State University, and a BA from Western Washington University, where she's living now in Bellingham. And lucky you, Dr. Trautman, that you can still live in Bellingham. And she does a lot of research on the activities between the US and Canada border, in British Columbia, Washington State in particular, and she'll tell us more about that. But the topics include trade, transportation, security, human mobility. And so she works with faculty and students, and she collaborates with the private sector and government agencies to research and then advance policy solutions that balance this cross-border flow of people and technology and businesses. So we're very, very fortunate to have Dr. Trautman here tonight. And so let me say one more thing, because I might forget at the end. For next month's program, we're not going to be on our same schedule of the third Thursday. We're going to have an in-person only presentation April 11th. April 11th, our speaker is from the University of Prague from Czech Republic. He is coming here on a book tour because he's just finished writing a research and writing a book about Czechoslovakian immigrants to the United States, mostly to the Pacific Northwest. But because of the war in Ukraine and the European Union and NATO, he's going to talk about what the Czech Republic is doing now in all of that situation. So I just would like you to put April 11th, 7:30 out at the Lacey campus of the South Puget Sound Community College, where we used to be before COVID. So this will be our first in-person Olympia World Affairs Council presentation, April 11th, about the Czech Republic. So let me now turn it back over to Dr. Trautman, and you are going to share your screen, and we'll make sure that everything works technically for you.
Okay, how does that look, Nina?
That looks great.
All right.
Andrew is recording it, so very good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks, John and the World Affairs Council for the invitation to speak tonight. I do sort of wish that I could be in person with you all, but I'm glad that you're able to join from the comfort of wherever you are. So I'm going to speak today about several different aspects of the Canada-US border and our region here, but I will first start by introducing what the Border Policy Research Institute is. As I was explaining earlier to Nina, we're small but mighty. We do a lot, but many people have not actually heard of us. So there we go. So we, broadly speaking, are engaged in research and collaboration and outreach. And just to give you a little bit of a background on why we exist, we were formed out of a partnership between Don Alper, who was a professor here at Western Washington University and a specialist in Canadian-US relations, and Senator Patty Murray, who actually was able to secure some funding to establish this institute. And the idea behind establishing the institute was really to better understand the influence of the border on various aspects of Washington State's economy and our people here. And after 9/11 happened and the border came to a grinding halt, I think there was really a recognition that we didn't understand the influence of the border on our state. And so having a dedicated research entity located, we're just about 20, 25 miles south of the border here in Bellingham, is a real asset to the state. And broadly speaking, our mission is essentially to improve cross-border mobility, to reduce the friction of the border, and by extension of that, to really support and foster the cross-border relationships that enable us to work together in a better, more efficient way. And we look at a variety of different topics. We do some cross-border environmental work, businesses, transportation, et cetera. And I'll explain a little bit about that right now. Research, we do a lot of different kinds of research. This picture here on the right with the cars is actually a Western Washington University student who is surveying border crossers as they enter the United States. And this is a project we do every 4 to 5 years, and it gives us a really good understanding of who's entering the state through our land ports of entry, where they're going, what they're doing. The security agencies like Customs and Border Protection use this information to get a sense of maybe why people don't have Nexus cards, which is that trusted traveler program. The chambers of commerce locally use this information to understand where are their Canadian customers coming from, where are they going to, and maybe how often are they visiting. So it's relevant information from both a border management perspective and also a tourism perspective as well. From a collaboration standpoint, I just sort of threw some of the links or the logos of the different entities that we work with. We collaborate with a lot of universities, actually, ironically, more so in Canada than in the US, specifically really the University of Victoria and Simon Fraser. We work with our similar entities on the Canadian side. I would say that there is not actually a comparable entity to us on the US side that's focused on Canada-US border policy, which is usually surprising when I tell people that, that there isn't other areas that have this same sort of capacity. So it is really a niche sort of focus. And then there's some broader coalitions that I'll actually get into more at the end of the presentation. The Cascadia Innovation Corridor is one that I'll kind of dive into for the purposes of this talk, but organizations and initiatives that are oriented towards cross-border collaboration, whether that's from private sector standpoint, transportation sector standpoint, or even government collaboration as well. And then in terms of outreach, before COVID, did a lot of traveling and speaking, finding that starting up again over this past year. I speak to the media a lot. This picture at the Peace Arch was probably one of the highlights of my career so far, where Rick Steves came up to Whatcom County and he did a little piece on the border. And so I got to film that with him. And for any of you who are a fan of Rick Steves, he's a really nice guy. It was really, really fun meeting him. So in terms of sort of an extension of our outreach, we do a lot of white papers. And unlike kind of a traditional academic department might do, we tend to write really short and really concise briefs. We call them sort of border policy briefs, and they tend to be 2 to 3 to 4 pages. They're really aimed at government policymakers, people who aren't going to sit down and read a 40-page paper. And I included just sort of a random assortment of some of the briefs we've done over the last few years. We tend to write about 3 to 4 a year. This one in the back was actually a comparison we did between Canadian and US efforts to combat human trafficking. We looked regionally between BC and Washington. This was an interesting project because we found that one of the main obstacles to better collaborating on human trafficking issues was actually a mismatch between the way we define certain terms and the way we collect certain data. So kind of things that we could overcome and we could work together towards rectifying to really solve an important issue. The middle one there, emerging from the pandemic, gosh, for probably 2 years, I did nothing but write about the pandemic border restrictions because they were such a shock to sort of the ethos of the Canada-US border, which had never been closed before the pandemic border restrictions. And then this last brief here was written by one of our faculty fellows, which is looking at some of the work of the Nooksack River International Task Force. As many of you likely know, in the fall of 2021, the Nooksack River, which flows through Whatcom County, spilled its banks, flooded many communities throughout Whatcom County, and then also up towards the Canadian border, crossed the border, closed the port of entry, and flooded the town of Abbotsford. So she was looking at ways that task force had kind of failed in some of its missions, with the goal of perhaps improving that collaboration moving forward and being better prepared for the next flooding event. And then this other paper here, a border barometer, this is something we try to do, again, every 4 to 5 years, collaborating with other universities along the US-Canada border, all the way from Alaska to Vermont, to really sort of look at the unique nature of different cross-border regions that are really connected in different ways. And even though border policy is, of course, federal, it's applied equally along the border. So we see different regional and local impacts from federal border policy. And we certainly saw that during the pandemic border restrictions, with some places being impacted differently than others. And this is one that's funded by the Canadian government, by our partners at the Seattle Canadian Consulate, and a really great example of a partnership between collaborators and the Canadian government, who's actually sending money to the US side of the border so that they can better understand these issues as well. So my talk today is kind of divided into 3 parts. Because this is sort of a World Affairs Council group, I thought I would start a little bit broadly, looking at an overview of Canada-US border policy and relations. Then I'll look at the pandemic border restrictions that were enacted during COVID-19, sort of transition to how those were impacting communities and economies more regionally. And then the last portion of the talk will be really looking at what I call the Cascadia cross-border regions. So kind of the western region of British Columbia through Washington State, and some might include Western Oregon in that as well. So when we think about Canada-US sort of relations, we could talk about a variety of topics. We could talk about trade, travel, security, but it's really the border that literally, and I think figuratively as well, binds our 2 countries together. And so when I think about Canada-US relations, I really think about them through the lens of border policy. And I think that can tell us a lot about kind of what's working and what isn't between our 2 countries in a very tangible way. So you often hear this line when we think about the US-Canadian border, that it's the world's longest undefended border. And it looks very different depending on where you are. On the left here is obviously a stretch through the wilderness. On the right is the Detroit-Windsor corridor, connecting 2 densely populated cities via bridge. And overall, the border is over 5,000 miles long. And interestingly, it's marked by 18,000 monuments that are maintained by something called the International Boundary Commission. So we certainly do dedicate a lot of resources and a lot of attention to kind of marking that line as long and as wild as many parts of it are. But even though we can look on a map and we can see that the border is sort of a line, in the case of Canada and the US, it's really becoming less of a line and increasingly a perimeter. And I think this is a really interesting and unique and innovative feature of the Canada-US border, which says a lot about how our 2 countries trust each other, and also what we're able to accomplish through border policy when we do work together and we share information and we share intelligence. So this kind of perimeter concept of the border not just being a dividing line between the 2 countries really dates back to the 1950s and the creation of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which many of you may have heard of. This was kind of a 1950s Cold War era initiative between the US and Canada. And the idea was that if Russia was ever to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile to the United States, it would go over Canadian airspace first. So it would behoove the United States to include Canada in sort of that aerospace perimeter. And the picture on the lower right there is sort of the old Cheyenne Mountain Command Center I got to visit some years ago. And that's not the place where NORAD operates from anymore. It's much more high tech and sort of 21st century now. But you can see in the other picture, it really does involve Canadians and Americans sitting together, sharing intelligence, sharing information, and monitoring airspace together. And in fact, on the morning of 9/11, when the terrorist attacks happened, it was actually a Canadian commander who was in charge that day at NORAD and who initiated the initial response. So really, I think a good example of how our countries can work together in a very collaborative and innovative way, and I think reflective of the Canada-US relationship for quite some time. And this is sort of continued to happen for the US and Canada to take a perimeter approach. And we saw this happen after sort of the 9/11 era. For a few years after 9/11, there was this huge contraction and securitization of borders. But then as we started to come out of that and look to Canada as a trusted partner, we started to do innovative things again on the border. And some of those are the Trusted Trader and Traveler Program. I mentioned the Nexus card. It's probably sort of a little less popular in Olympia, but in Bellingham, most people know what this is. It's a card that you apply to both the Canadian and the American security agencies for a security clearance, essentially to be able to cross the border much more quickly than if you're in the main lane. It's like TSA pre-check, but for the border. And the neat thing about this program is you actually interview with the Canadian and an American side by side, and they're sharing that information and they're sharing that whole screening process. And there's a similar program for cargo known as FAST, Free and Secure Trade Program. And then another really interesting and innovative border policy program between Canada and the US is pre-clearance. And some of you have probably experienced this when you've been flying back to the US, either from Canada or from an airport in another part of the world. I know Dublin and Abu Dhabi, and there's a number of airports that have this pre-clearance agreement with the United States that essentially you clear customs and immigration by a US officer in a foreign country before you even get on the airplane. So when you get on the airplane and you land in Seattle or you could land in Bellingham, you wouldn't have to clear customs and immigration upon arrival. So it's really the idea of sort of identifying potential threats before they even reach the border or before they even cross onto US soil. And in 2016, Canada and the US signed an agreement to expand this concept to our land, marine, and rail crossings. And this actually has a big impact on our region here. So if you've ever taken the Coho ferry, which I'm guessing many of you have, or you've taken the Amtrak Cascades train across the border, you'll recall that when you boarded the Coho or you boarded the train in Canada, you saw a US officer. That was your immigration clearing. And then when you got to the US side, you still had to clear customs. So the pre-clearance agreement is sort of rolling that all into one and having all of that now being done on Canadian soil. So it's still being implemented, but eventually when you get on the Amtrak train in Vancouver, you will no longer have to stop at the border in Blaine and have the customs officers come on and clear the train. And that's always been very problematic because it's an sort of unpredictable amount of time that it's going to take for them to clear the train. People get pulled off and then they miss the train and they can't get back on. So it's actually a huge efficiency and security benefit that's modeled off of some of these programs that we've had here in the Pacific Northwest for decades and that are finally kind of getting formalized. But kind of wild stuff if you think about it, because you have a US officer on Canadian soil essentially performing US customs and immigration duties. So again, it requires a lot of collaboration and a lot of trust between not just the two countries, but the agencies and the people who are involved in those operations. And all of this was really possible by what was called the Beyond the Border Accord, signed in 2011. And this was the last border policy accord that the US and Canada had. And it kind of fell on the heels of a number of border accords that had come before that had laid out what do we want to do together on the border? What do we want to accomplish? And it laid out the policy agenda so that agencies could implement these innovative ideas. So the Beyond the Border Accord really enabled Nexus program and enabled pre-clearance. And it really said, we are going to develop this perimeter approach because we think it provides a lot of security benefits, but also a lot of efficiency benefits for both countries. And so again, we had this kind of sweetheart time on the border after we kind of came out of those post 9/11 years. And during that time, we had great US border policy relations, and they span the political spectrum. So this is a picture of Prime Minister Harper, and in both of these on the left and the right. He was on the conservative spectrum, and he had great relations with both Bush and Obama, and really got a lot of great things done. Then we had Trudeau come on the scene when Harper left, and we had a very short bromance between Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau, where they got along really well. They were on the same side of the political spectrum, but they were only overlapped for, I think, about a year. So they didn't do much in terms of border policy. And then we all know what came after Obama, which was the relationship between Trump and Trudeau. That was, of course, very problematic, probably the most problematic Canada-US relationship between two leaders that I can remember that probably ever existed, to be honest. And so we had this situation where I like to use political cartoons because I think that they can really capture a lot of different dynamics in one fell swoop. And this one really sort of captures the imbalance of power between Canada and the United States, the imbalance of size, the need for Canada to really try to maintain neutral ground, try to maintain good relations with American neighbors. You have Trudeau here saying, whatever the obstacles, our two nations have always gotten along. And then Trump just sort of saying, saying what he's going to say. And some years ago, he had called Trudeau very dishonest and weak. And so we found ourselves in a situation in North America where our top political relations were incredibly strained and not even just strained, but almost adversarial, which, between two allies, between two top trading partners is not a very usual situation. But I think more importantly than sort of the optics at the top of the US and Canadian federal governments was really the administrative and the bureaucratic channels that existed between Canada and the United States, which had always been very strong, kind of those working relationships. And when the Trump administration came in, we really saw a hollowing out of people at the Department of Homeland Security, at the Department of State. We had 3 acting US ambassadors to Canada in just 2 to 3 years. So just a lot of instability and a lot of institutional capacity really lost. And I think those civil servant relationships were the ones that really supported Canada-US collaboration, particularly on policy agreements. So over the successive years that followed those comments by Trump, we saw continued strain between the relationships. The first cartoon here of the beaver was sort of this joke on Trump administration's rhetoric around building a wall on the Mexican border, and the Canadians sort of saying, well, maybe we should have a border with the United States. I thought this clip was a very interesting one, The Patriot's Guide to Shopping During a Canada-US Trade War. You might remember that the US imposed tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel under the auspices of national security, which to many Canadians was really offensive and sort of uncalled for. We had the NAFTA renegotiations, and again, sort of that real imbalance of power between Trump and Canada, but also Mexico as well. And the NAFTA negotiations being an example where you had the president of the United States sort of threatening to tear up this free trade deal that had been really quite prosperous for many US businesses. So I think these politics, they sort of set up the Canada-US relationship as a very fraught and strained one. And then, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic that entered in at sort of the perfect storm of a time. So this last cartoon here is the border guards, Canadian border guards saying, do you get the feeling that Canadians are in no hurry to reopen the border? And that was certainly the case. They were not in a hurry to open the border. So I'll talk a little bit about the pandemic border restrictions as well, and kind of that intersection between the national politics, how it played out in different places, specifically in our region, and then how public health was sort of interwoven in there as well, which is sort of very unusual. As somebody who does border policy, I never thought I'd find myself doing a whole lot in regards to public health, but it's now something that we're looking at very closely with pandemics being such a sort of interwoven aspect of border management now. So it was almost exactly 3 years ago, I think a week from now, it will be exactly 3 years, that US and Canada agreed to restrict all non-essential travel at their shared land border. And this was an agreement that was extended every 30 days for almost a year and a half. And I'll just sort of walk you through what some of the parameters of that agreement were, how it impacted people and economies, and then some of the sort of ways that we could have collaborated together, but we failed to do so. So looking at the restrictions, again, we divided travel between essential and non-essential. And I think most people feel that this was a pretty smart move at the beginning of the restrictions because it allowed trucks to keep going back and forth. It allowed essential goods to keep moving back and forth. It allowed things like toilet paper to keep moving back and forth, which it's funny to remember that we were worried about that once upon a time. But it also created a problematic divide to a certain extent, deciding who was essential, what was essential, and what was non-essential. Now, the weird thing is the U.S. continued to allow air travel from Canada throughout the pandemic for any reason. We decided to only restrict our Canadian entries at the land and ferry borders. Canada had a federal quarantine act, which the United States did not have, and it essentially said that anybody who was not essential, who might be returning from the United States or anywhere else in the world for that matter, had to do a mandatory quarantine of 2 weeks. And this was something that was monitored. There was actually health officers that called people when they re-entered across the border to make sure that they were quarantining at home. And there was a certain period of time where Canada went as far as requiring air travelers to quarantine in government-run hotels. And some other countries around the world did this as well. And it was something that didn't last very long because it was very costly for the traveler and very problematic and not a system that the government was capable of really running either. At some point in the pandemic, I think it was maybe about 10 or 12 months in, Canada did exempt immediate family members for compassionate reasons. So if you were a mother or you were a spouse, you were able to cross the border if you could prove that you had an important reason to do so. The United States never carved out that exemption, but their approach was to say, if you show up at the border and we think your reason is valid, then you can cross. So very different way of handling those situations. And as I mentioned, the restrictions were renewed every 30 days for a year and a half. I think it's important to note that neither country ever had a plan in place for lifting those restrictions. That made it very difficult for people who were wanting to cross, were needing to cross. They had no real guidelines for what they might expect in terms of those restrictions easing. I think it also points to a real lack of collaboration that the two governments didn't have a plan. We also lifted our restrictions in an uncoordinated and unaligned way. In the summer of 2021, Canada started to allow vaccinated travelers entry. The US didn't follow suit until November. Canada had required testing at the land border until just about a year ago. The US never required testing at the land border, and the US still requires vaccination for foreign nationals. So you're probably like trying to keep track of all of these different things. And I can assure you that it was an incredibly complicated landscape, incredibly difficult for travelers to navigate these quickly changing policies that were different on both sides of the border. Because something I've always argued is if you're crossing the border in one way, you're probably crossing it the other way. And not having information in sort of an integrated fashion becomes very, very difficult for travelers who are really caught in the middle. So there's a real question about how much these pandemic border restrictions were about public health and how much they were about politics. We certainly know that there was very different politics in Canada and the US around COVID in general. Canadians, for the most part, in huge numbers, supported maintaining the border restrictions. On the US side, I don't know that we really even thought about them that much unless you lived in a border community like where I live. Many of these policies on both sides were really divorced from public health. Throughout the pandemic, I mentioned essential travel was able to go back and forth. Now, that wasn't just truck drivers transporting essential goods. That was people who might be working for a marketing firm or a PR company or an executive at a Ford Motor Company who, because they were crossing regularly enough, crossing the border was considered an essential part of their job, but they weren't doing essential work per se. We also had plenty of trucks moving back and forth that were by no means transporting essential goods. They were probably transporting a lot of Amazon packages, but they were able to cross. And as a result, there was over 9 million trips made just into the US from Canada without any health requirements whatsoever. So kind of a huge hole in this way of trying to control health at the border. As I mentioned, the US also allowed air travel from Canada throughout the pandemic. So a Canadian could fly to Disney World on a US carrier to the United States or for any trip purpose whatsoever. But if you lived in a border community and you might want to say farewell to a dying loved one, you may or may not have been able to cross. And when you think about sort of the health implications of getting on a plane versus driving your car across the border, it's pretty clear that there was a large disconnect between the policies and the actual real concern for protecting public health. Canada also had a very interesting testing and quarantine regime. I mentioned the quarantine regime, but at one point, Canadians were required to have 3 negative COVID tests and still quarantine for 2 weeks upon returning to Canada. So again, from a public health standpoint, it doesn't really make sense. From a political standpoint, perhaps it does. And I wanted to mention this quote from the Canadian ambassador to the United States. I was on a webinar that was talking about these restrictions, and somebody sort of asked her, look, why isn't there more collaboration between Canada and the US? We're neighbors, we're allies, we're friends. We should be really working together on these issues. And she actually said, we both are committed to making decisions based on science and the advice of experts. And those are our experts, our science, our country. So you really kind of see how the nationalism sort of came back in the Canada-US border policy relationship. And this wasn't by any means unique to Canada and the United States. I was in Norway and Sweden last summer interviewing people along the border about their experience during the restrictions. And that's an area that had no border controls, even before the existence of the European Union. And all of a sudden, there was hard borders, people patrolling them with firearms, and a real clear sense of nationalism between Norwegians and Swedes. But I think, overall, what's challenging is that the restrictions were really frustrating for people who tried to navigate them. And there was this sense on the ground that the government just wasn't listening or really even trying to problem solve. They were sort of kicking the can down the road by extending the restrictions every 30 days. And the result was really devastating to a lot of people and communities and economies that relied on the border. So just some of the economic impacts. I mentioned that business travelers were still allowed to cross the border if they were considered commuters. So if you were somebody who worked for, say, the manufacturing sector and you needed to make a site visit in order to sign a contract for your business, you probably weren't going to be allowed to cross back and forth, or maybe you would, but there'd be too much uncertainty to be able to plan for that. So we saw a lot of business contracts really sort of fall apart, particularly in the manufacturing sector. That was kind of more in the Detroit-Windsor corridor. In terms of borderland economies, where I live in Whatcom County, I consider our area to be a borderland economy. We have cities that are located right along the border that have businesses completely dedicated to Canadian customers. Some of those are parcel pickup companies where Canadians can have a PO box. They cross into Blaine or Sumas or Linden, and they can pick up their parcels that they ordered using domestic shipping because the address is within the US. This is a huge business and a pretty big tax base for some of these communities, and that just completely dried up. And then, of course, we saw cross-border tourism really suffer, and a lot of that infrastructure has still not recovered. There used to be a ferry route between Anacortes that stopped in Friday Harbor and went on to Sydney, BC. That, of course, was shut down during the pandemic, and it still hasn't started back up, and it probably won't be in operation this summer. So it's sort of an example how it's a lot easier to close things down than it is to get them started up again. And the social impacts are something that I have looked at a lot over the last few years, and something that I've really tried to highlight to decision makers, especially in the realm of border policy, because it's something that's really hard to quantify, but something that was really devastating for people who had built their lives up around the assumption that the Canada-US border would function, right? I mean, we're two advanced societies and democracies, and if you have the right documents, you just sort of assume that I can be married to somebody who lives on the other side of the border, or my grandkids can be on the other side of the border, and it's no problem to go see them. And those were the people who really, really suffered because they couldn't go see their loved ones. And they were already dealing with the impacts of the pandemic, which, as we all know, was not fun times. I think the elderly, the impaired, and non-native English speakers were really disadvantaged during this time. I mentioned how complicated those border restrictions were. And if you weren't tech savvy and you didn't know where to go for the information, it became pretty much impossible to try to navigate that policy landscape. And finally, just sort of the continued uncertainty and frustration and anxiety that people felt, which I think some people are still sort of feeling that. And there's a real question of, do these communities go back to the way they were, or do they remain sort of stunted by the impact of having that border restricted, which up here in Whatcom County, we're still about 40% fewer Canadians than we had before the pandemic. I think this summer we'll see if we start to recover in terms of cross-border movement, but we're still pretty low considering that there's almost no border restrictions in place. I think the US will lift the final vaccination requirement for foreign nationals in May. And all of this played out in really interesting ways here in our region. Some of you may have been to the Peace Arch Park, just located in Blaine, right at the border between Canada and the United States. And this was, it's a very unique park because you can enter the park from the Canadian side and you can enter it from the US side, and you can be in the park with people, regardless of what side they entered it, without having to actually cross the border. So if you aren't eligible to enter Canada, if you don't have a passport, you can go to the Peace Arch Park and you can sit and have coffee or a picnic with your friends and relatives from Canada. So it's the only place in North America where that's possible. So as a result, thousands and thousands of people came from all over the US to come to this park during the pandemic to be able to see their Canadian loved ones. And the couple pictures here show this was a family this was actually the last time that this grandkid saw his grandfather, the man in the wheelchair, before he passed away, and they were able to be together in the park. The picture of the wedding is one of many weddings that happened in the Peace Arch Park in the summer of 2020 and then also in the summer of 2021. In fact, so many people came to the park that the BC side closed down, and there was this huge sort of backlash from the community around all these people coming to the park. And the initial backlash was sort of a response to just too many cars, too many people parking in this residential neighborhood. But then it sort of really got bound up in these broader national politics, and I think started to reflect the broader Canada-US relations and kind of the US handling of the pandemic. And some of these news clips kind of start to hint at that, at the Canadian perspective of, if you go to this park and you interact with Americans, you're going to get COVID and you're going to bring it back. So there was a lot of pressure actually on Governor Inslee to close the US side of the park. And that did not happen. The park remained open as any other park in Washington state did. But the feeling of the park began to change. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police started to kind of patrol the area and check people's documents. And like I said before, it had been a place where you never had to have documents to go. But I think the situation here at the Peace Arch Park, which got national media attention, the New York Times did pieces on it, the Globe and Mail, it was really a hotspot for the media, was really an interesting example of how the border restrictions were often more about politics than they were about protecting public health. And that cost of that was really borne by the loved ones who were kept apart during the restrictions. Another example here in our region of the impact of the border restrictions is Point Roberts. And some of you may have heard of Point Roberts. It's this little blip of land that's sort of right across from Blaine that's just cut off by the 49th parallel. So it's US territory. It's technically an exclave, but it's essentially almost an island because it's completely cut off from the United States. So if you live in Point Roberts and you want to come to Blaine for coffee, you have to cross into Canada, cross back into the United States, then you cross back into Canada and back in the United States to go back home. So you can imagine how this community was impacted by the border restrictions. Again, lots of national media. There was something like over 400 media stories. People were flying out there to interview people about their experiences. And I talked to a lot of people at Point Roberts. I still talk to a lot of people in Point Roberts. And the frustrating thing was this is a very, very isolated community. They get all of their natural resources from Canada. They depend very heavily on Canadians. And for most of the pandemic, they didn't have a single COVID case. At some point in 2021, they started to have a handful, but they had a very strong testing program run through their fire department, and very, very few COVID cases. But still, we couldn't figure out a way to develop some kind of agreement between Canada and the US to let these people cross through Canada and enter the United States for any trip purpose. They were allowed to cross for some things, but not for others. So there were situations of people that I spoke with who perhaps a spouse had to get a tooth pulled and they're driving across the border and they were denied entry because the person driving them wasn't traveling for an essential purpose. Things like that happened. And so the thing about Point Roberts, I think it highlights a diplomatic failure between Canada and the US. There was ways that we could have solved this situation, but we're unable to. And it also highlights the enduring impact of doing something as drastic as restricting a border. Point Roberts is still having a very, very hard time recovering. And I think if you ask the people that live there, at least the ones that I've spoken to, they'd say there's still a fair bit of uncertainty as to whether or not their economy will be able to recover even as the border restrictions are lifted. So the final section that I'm going to speak about is the Cascadia cross-border region. So really sort of bringing it down to our region here, looking a little bit at governance and collaboration and also place. And I like to start out by talking about the Cascadia border region by showing what it isn't. And, we all live here, so we sort of know this, but I think the visual is compelling. This is a picture I took some years ago at the other end of I-5. If you drive down to Tijuana and you pass through San Diego, this is what the border looks like there. Obviously, incredibly securitized and fortified and impassable. If you got in your car and you drove up I-5 and you came up to Blaine, you'd get to the Peace Arch Park. This is a picture of an interview I did with a Canadian media company, and we just stood at the park, and that's them in Canada, and I'm taking the picture from the United States, and the signs around us say things like, sure, your pet's on a leash, or leaving the US border, but they're very unobtrusive. And while we were standing here doing this interview, people are just walking back and forth because, again, they're entering the park. They're able to leave the park if they return via the side from which they came. So very much a feeling of openness. And again, I think that rests on a notion of trust. And I also think it's very interesting to compare the two parks. So this is Friendship Park down again at the San Diego, Tijuana region. People do have the ability to be in the same space like they have at the Peace Arch Park, but you can see this picture down below. It's very monitored. The capacity is controlled, and the park closes at certain hours, and you're surrounded by metal fences. Not the most sort of relaxing environment to spend time with your loved ones. And then here at the Peace Arch Park, we just have a completely different environment. We have huge, or pre-COVID at least, we had big gatherings, people really having a sense of sort of fluidity and freedom in the park. And of course, the park is heavily surveyed. There's border patrol, there's monitoring being done through cameras, but there's still that feeling of openness. And I think this is something I've spoken to border groups around the world, and it's surprising how many places have seen this Peace Arch monument and how iconic it is as a symbol of friendship and collaboration and trust and openness. And I truly believe that we do have that, maybe more in our region than even at the national scale. And I think it's something that gives us a real edge that we can really build upon here. So, the question of whether or not we have a region is sort of an open one. I think we have a region, but I think we have a region to the extent that we sort of believe we have a cohesive region. I think of it as Cascadia. Some people think of it as Pacific Northwest. You might call it the Salish Sea. But more or less, when I think of this region, I think of that kind of coastal area that essentially runs down the western coast of Washington State, up through British Columbia and Vancouver Island. And I think we're connected by a lot of things. And I'll just sort of walk you through a few maps because I'm a geographer, so I like to use maps to tell stories. But I think largely we're connected via kind of common quality of life values, political values, and environmental values. So certainly if you look at a map of the Salish Sea, that's a connector in a regional concept. The idea of the Salish Sea is something that was actually born out of a Western Washington University professor, Bert Weber. It was coined in 2009, and it refers to three separate bodies of water, the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the Puget Sound. And if I've seen the Salish Sea is really increasingly a term that's being used, and I think having a common place name really does create regional cohesiveness and a regional identity. We also have a very complex mix of over 60 indigenous nations. In the US, we call them tribes, of course, and in Canada, we call them First Nations. These are sovereign territories. Many of them span the border, and it creates a complicated overlap of jurisdictions, sovereign nations. We've got the state, we have the province, and then we have two federal governments. So the issue of the border in indigenous communities is a very problematic one for a number of reasons, because we do have so many that exist here in this region. And we also have a lot of cross-border infrastructure, which is something that I end up focusing on a lot. Our region is home to, depending on the year, usually about the second busiest border crossing area along the Canada-US border. There's Detroit, Windsor, and Buffalo, Niagara, and we're sort of always in competition with those areas. But we have 5 land ports of entry. The numbers in blue here show the number of people, or not individuals, but the number of trips. So all in all, we have millions of trips that are typically made into Washington State from Canada, whether that's across the land border, the ferry routes, the Amtrak rail line, or the multiple flight paths that connect BC and Washington State. It amounts to around 12 million trips per year in pre-pandemic times. It remains to be seen sort of what the new normal is coming out of the pandemic. But I mentioned, yeah, sometimes we're the second, the third, the first busiest border crossing region. And $18 billion of trade moves just via our land border crossings. So they play a huge role in both the state's economy, but also in the national economy as well. And some of that is moving all the way down to Mexico too. Looking at a couple of our other cross-border linkages, we have really integrated supply chains. So we're not just trading things, we're building things together. One example that's very apparent here in Whatcom County is our refineries. A lot of the refinery work that goes on here in Whatcom County is actually refining Canadian oil, comes down here via pipeline, and then we export it back to Canada. We often have barges that sit just off the coast here that are waiting to refuel and go back to Canada. We also have a really integrated and innovative aerospace industry. The first electric seaplane, I believe in North America, but it could be in the world, but I believe in North America for sure, was built by Harbor Air just in 2019. It did its maiden run, and that was built using parts from manufacturers in Washington State. We also have a really integrated tech sector. Both Microsoft and Amazon, but a host of other tech companies have offices in both Seattle and Vancouver and are increasingly sort of utilizing the Canadian platform to bring in workers from around the world. That really helps their local industries flourish as well and kind of builds up this tech ecosystem. And then, of course, we have economic networks as well. Tourism, shopping, air travel here in Bellingham, our airport relies on Canadians. I think it's about 65% of our enplaned passengers tend to be Canadians. We have a lot of same-day Canadian shoppers, or we did before the pandemic. This picture of Pirate Joe's was a very interesting example of sort of cross-border linkages, where the joke in Bellingham is that you have Canadians love Trader Joe's, and so they come down to Trader Joe's to go shopping. And there was actually a Canadian who opened up something called Pirate Joe's in Vancouver and would come down to Bellingham, load up on Trader Joe's goods and sell them at Pirate Joe's. So sort of this sort of cultural bleed over, and eventually he got sued by Trader Joe's, and that doesn't exist anymore. But I think it's an interesting example of sort of cross-border economic, social linkages. We also have a fairly new media outlet called the Cascadia Daily News here, and that's really meant to capture, again, all of Cascadia, a lot of content from Canada and British Columbia as well. And then, of course, those social and cultural networks, lots of families, lots of friends, lots of dual citizens that rely on the border and the Canadian relationship. And we have increasing number of sports rivalries as well. I don't know if the Kraken would exist if we didn't have rivalries in Vancouver. So we also have a lot of shared environmental challenges, and this is something that my institute is starting to work more on, particularly coming out of the Nooksack River floods, but also in recognition of other natural hazards that, of course, no boundaries, but spill over them. And this map here of the Nooksack River watershed is one that we thought would be really easy to find. We couldn't find this map anywhere, so we got some students and we said, "Hey, can you just find the floodplains and make a map?" But it has to cross the border, so it shows the actual floodplains. And it took them an incredible amount of work to find a map that could show both floodplains, because it turns out that Canada's federal agency doesn't map the Nooksack River because it's not in Canada. The city of Abbotsford does, because the city of Abbotsford has experienced flooding from the river. So I think this map actually tells a very interesting story around how the border is a real impediment to some of these shared environmental challenges. And so some questions we're asking is, how do we develop the tools to really work together across borders when we tend to have maps that stop at the borders? So certainly cross-border watersheds is one component of that. That bleeds into orca recovery in the Salish Sea, and increasingly forest fires and urban smoke as well. So I think I'm actually coming up to a little towards the end of our time. So I don't want to talk for the whole time. I want to allow some time for questions. Is that right, Nina? Do we go till 8:30?
Yeah, you have a few more minutes, and then
Okay.
there are some questions coming in, and I'll encourage others to do so. And so why don't you finish up on your slides?
Okay, I will wrap it up. So I guess I said this before, but I think it's really important to note that the border really does impact our region's resiliency. We have maps like these that just sort of stop at the border. We face challenges around data collection and modeling, capacity, funding, coordination, and also governance. So I'm going to skip through a little bit of this and just get to what is almost my last slide, which is one example of the way that we are trying to work together in a holistic way to address a lot of different emergent and sharing issues. And this is something called the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. And this is an initiative that was actually initiated by Microsoft back in 2016, initially sort of looking at the tech sector and how do we develop a tech ecosystem between Vancouver and Seattle, but has really since expanded to look at things like climate change and just sort of how do we work together on a variety of different issues that we share and that we are continue to face in an increasing way. And at the summit we had last year, it was up here in Blaine, and we actually had Bill Gates present talking about some of his climate work. And then the man he's talking to is the vice president of Microsoft. So there's some real great leadership here. The governor and the premier, and now also the governor of Oregon, the new governor of Oregon, are involved. They've signed memorandums of understanding, looking at things like, can we develop a high-speed rail system? I'll show this real quickly, and then that's actually my last slide. This is a project that maybe some of you have heard of. It's got to stop in Olympia, so you would be impacted by it if it ever was to come to fruition. And this is an initiative of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor to try to advance the first high-speed rail system in North America to connect Vancouver, Seattle, and also Portland. So that is actually it for me. Sorry, I went a little longer than I thought I would, but I'd be thrilled to take some questions.
Thank you, Laurie. That was terrific and so much information. Before we do take questions, I would like to thank our Lieutenant Governor, Denny Heck, for joining us today. I was doing my introductory remarks and failed to bring him on So thank you, Denny, for joining us. We're glad that our Lieutenant Governor is interested in this issue, and I'm sure he works on it a lot with you, Laurie. So I will ask a couple of questions that are on here, and Amy, you can jump in too if you see some other questions. The first one that came in was about Canada and the Ukraine. And do you know how supportive Canada is when it comes to supplying arms to the Ukraine? I know that's slightly out of your topic area, but maybe you can enlighten us.
That is out of my topic area. I do know that they have been supportive to a certain degree. I don't know if people would consider that to be, enough or not enough. But there's quite a bit of arms manufacturing done in Canada. So I do know that they have been supportive. I know they have a very large Ukrainian population and they have welcomed Ukrainian refugees. I can't really say more than that, though.
That's okay. Follow-up question from the same person. Can you contrast the immigration policy of Canada with that of the United States?
Great question. At a very high level, I would say that Canada has a system that is more oriented towards like a points system and a high skilled system. So the US system is much more oriented towards family reunification. So, for example, myself as an American with an advanced degree would probably not have a hard time immigrating to Canada, especially given the nature of the work that I do. But if my equivalent wanted to immigrate to the United States, they'd have to go through a much longer and lengthier process unless they were claiming family reunification. So a very different system. The interesting thing about that question is the U.S. is looking at developing, or maybe we already are in the process of advancing it, a refugee system that's actually a little bit more similar to Canada's, where we'd have a sponsorship program to bring in more refugees, which Canada already has in place, and they have also the ability for new immigrants, new refugees, new asylum seekers to work pretty quickly, whereas the US usually requires people to wait a lot longer before they're able to get work permits. So that's actually a huge disconnect in terms of integration as well.
Hmm, interesting. Okay, and I think Amy, you were going to ask the next couple of questions.
Sure. The next question we have is, can you comment on the status of the renegotiation of the Columbia River
Mm.
Treaty?
Wow, you guys are asking good questions. We actually hosted a forum, back in 2018, where we had the negotiators here and we had tribal members here as well, because part of the issue around that treaty negotiation was to really bring in the perspectives of the tribes and the First Nations. Denny Heck actually probably knows more than I do, but the last I heard from the State Department, I was in Washington, D.C. in October, and they said that they were actually quite close to resolving that and signing it, and they expected to have something within this year, so within 2023. So I think it's moved on behind the scenes, but I'm not directly involved with that.
Can I just do a quick follow-up on that, Amy? So for the Columbia River Treaty, somebody might say, wait a minute, Columbia River, how does that relate to Canada? Because it does start, the Columbia River does start in Canada. But what could you just give us briefly, what was the main, what are the main issues there?
Yeah, so there's
Or
a lot of
is it just salmon, salmon, salmon?
some people might say that from the negotiating table, there's also issues around what the U.S. pays for what's called the entitlement. So it's the amount of energy we get from the dams. It's a very complicated calculation of what the charges should be for those energy costs. Canada says we're not paying enough. We say we're paying too much. There is a real issue around climate change and the dams not holding enough water and how that will be managed. There's a couple other things in there as well. But I think the entitlement, it's called, it was a pretty big one because that was about money. So
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for letting me interrupt. Amy, go ahead.
Sure. So our next question is, we must have a hiker in the group. What is the current status of the border crossing on the Pacific Crest Trail?
whoa.
Can a U.S. citizen enter Canada on the trail and then return to the U.S. via a more common route, such as road?
I don't know where that crossing is exactly. And I mean, I don't think there's anywhere along the border where you can cross without going through a port of entry that wouldn't be considered an illegal crossing. There might be something in Glacier Waterton around that, in the super isolated areas. And maybe there's some exception for the Pacific Crest Trail, but I'm not sure where exactly that crossing is.
Well, we definitely like to challenge you with our questions. So good try. Nina, did you want to ask your Tom's question?
I had one more question, and then we'll open it up if there are any others from the audience. But I wanted to know about any coordination of land use planning on the border, Bellingham, Vancouver, because Washington has a land use planning requirement, the Growth Management Act. The counties and cities carry that out. But there's the border, but there's the ecosystem. So it can be seen as one place, as you pointed out in your Salish Sea map. What's the connection in land use planning?
Yeah, and I hesitate again to speak a little bit outside of my expertise, but I think the extent to which there's land use planning is just both sides agreeing to talk to each other and to maybe coordinate to try to align some of these things. We did actually do a project some years ago looking at some of these issues around what policies are in place around land use planning and how they're different on both sides of the border. Because the jurisdictions are so separate, again, I don't think there's any formal sort of agreements in place that would govern what could be done on the other side of the border. Things that do get really interesting are where you have rivers that cross and where management on one side will really impact management on the other. In terms of specific to land use planning, yeah, I'd be surprised if there was any sort of umbrella agreement, because there wouldn't be the jurisdictional authority to enforce it unless it was just sort of like an MOU, like, yes, we're going to both agree to take this similar approach.
Yeah, interesting. Very, very good. Well, I don't see any other hands up, but I do have another question for you. It is, what would you recommend that we look for from your institute in terms of research papers that you want us to know about? What should we be watching for, and from your perspective? And then also, what are some of the cross-border issues that we may be seeing in the news or should be watching for?
Sure. Well, the first question, I think it sort of depends on what you're interested in. If the impacts of the COVID border restrictions are interesting, we'll be doing a lot of work around that. We have a partnership with Simon Fraser to look at how different groups of people were impacted in different ways by the restrictions, with an eye to inform both federal governments around what the implications are of their policies at the local level. We're also very interested in looking at what we can do around the FIFA World Cup, which is coming to both Seattle and Vancouver. And I anticipate going to bring a lot of people to our region. And I don't know that we're going to be prepared from a cross-border standpoint. So if you're a sports fan or anything like that, I think that's a really interesting topic to follow. In terms of sort of broader issues, the big one is really, do we recover to where we were before the pandemic? Operations like the Washington State ferries and the Clipper, are they going to be able to resume the service that they once had? That's a huge economic boom for many parts of our communities. The Koa Ferry obviously is a big one for Clallam County. And are we going to sort of have the same cross-border flows that we had before? Because I think, after 9/11 happened, I'll just say quickly that if you look broadly speaking at the US as a whole, we still have fewer people crossing the border than we did before 9/11. So 9/11 was a huge shock. We never really recovered from. Now, our region was different because we have a growing population. We had the Vancouver Olympics, which actually really boosted cross-border travel. We had innovations like the enhanced driver's license, which we developed here. Governor Gregoire was really involved in that. So can we sort of be a leader again in that Canadian relationship? And I think a lot of that happens between the province and the state. I don't think it happens by the federal governments trying to solve problems, from the other side of the country. So I think the extent to which we can foster collaboration and grow our cross-border relationships really bleeds out into a lot of other aspects of our economies and our communities, particularly when we're talking about huge challenges like climate-induced natural hazards, which we're likely going to continue to face in the years to come.
Very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Trautman. I don't know if I see any other hands up. So I will just say one more reminder about our in-person meeting on April 11th at 7:30 at the SPCC campus over in Lacey. And I want to thank Dr. Trautman so much for giving this presentation tonight. Really learned a lot and makes me realize I need to get up there.
Yes.
And see Vancouver and see Victoria and make sure my family has their passports so they can go. So anyway, I don't see any other questions, but thank you again, and we'll stay in touch.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye-bye, Laurie. See you.